I'm Jesse Ventura. Stay vigilant, question more.
Welcome to my world. Come along for the ride.
The world according to Jesse. Today we discuss the Trump administration's war with the World Trade Organization, justice for Breonna Taylor, and climate-driven mass migration. Sit tight. The show starts now. The world according to Jesse.
Hi, I'm Brigida Santos. For our top story today, a World Trade Organization panel has ruled that the Trump administration's tariffs on over $500 billion worth of Chinese goods are illegal. The panel has officially ruled against Washington's argument that Beijing wrongfully engages in practices that harm American interests, like property theft and technology transfer. According to panel experts, the U.S. broke international trade laws when imposing the tariffs back in 2018 because it did not demonstrate that the levies were justified. However, the ruling has no binding effect since President Trump rendered the WTO ineffective last year by blocking all new appointments to the organization's dispute resolution court. Now, one of the main reasons the WTO was created in 1995 was to allow countries to take each other to court to settle trade disputes. But now that President Trump has taken away the WTO High Court's ability to rule on new dispute cases, the organization has zero power to rule in future appeals cases, giving countries free rein to keep breaking international trade laws. While the WTO is not perfect, Jesse, it is one arena where we see international cooperation. President Trump has repeatedly claimed that the Geneva-based trade organization treats America unfairly, and now he's reshaped it so it can never rule against the U.S. Washington is now free to impose any tariffs on anyone it wants without the fear of breaking international laws. Jesse, what do you think about this?
Well, first of all, I'd love to see all the proof. You know, President Trump has a way about him where he says people are talking or people are saying. Well, what exactly did the WTO do that caused Donald Trump to pull out from it and literally have no relationship to it? And let's remember something else. When Trump puts tariffs on things from other countries, a tariff is just another name for tax. That means he's taxing it, which means what? The price of that item is going to go higher, which is going to increase inflation because of the tariffs applied. Now, I'm all for a sales tax. I wish we had a national sales tax and we would abolish the income tax. So sales taxes and tariffs are not necessarily bad, but over-taxation is bad. And in this case, I think it's a case of over-taxation with added on. And, you know, Trump's plan seems to be to go it alone on everything in the world today. He doesn't care about allies. I saw a thing the other day on TV. Our standing in the world today is atrocious. Germany, 10% of Germany thinks Donald Trump's doing a good job in America. 10%. Think about that.
Yeah, and as you said, this could absolutely backfire. If the rest of the world decides to create trade partnerships without the U.S., then what? Is Washington really going to allow other nations to have better access to each other's markets?
It's crazy, Brigida. I mean, we're literally taking ourselves out of it. We're taking ourselves out of the game to where we don't even have a dog in the fight. And I don't think that's a very good policy at all internationally to isolate ourselves. I could see us doing it with our military. I want to see us draw back our military, bring our kids home. We don't need to be the world's policeman no longer, but we still need international trade. You can't survive without trading with foreign countries today. And it seems that Trump wants to take this isolationist position. Is that the Republican view?
Well, in this show, we've discussed all the international principles and laws that the U.S. repeatedly breaks. So is the U.S. above the law?
Are we above the law? We like to think so, I think. I think we really believe that we are, in many cases, above the law because, like I said, we've stepped out of the climate change. We're not being involved in that worldly any longer. Now we're getting out of the WTO also. What is going to be left for us? Are we only going to be doing business with North Korea if Trump gets reelected?
In other news, a nurse at a Georgia Immigration and Customs Enforcement Detention Center has exposed rampant medical neglect and dangerous health practices at the facility. Nurse Dawn Wooden, who has worked at the Irwin County Detention Center for 3 years, says she was demoted after repeatedly warning management about the risk of staff members catching COVID-19 from 6 detainees. Nurses and staff were reportedly not told when they were in contact with symptomatic detainees or detainees who had tested positive for the novel coronavirus. Nurse Wooden's complaint to the Department of Homeland Security's Office of the Inspector General also raises red flags about the rate at which hysterectomies are performed on immigrant women in ICE custody. Several women whose uteruses were surgically removed say they didn't understand why they had to have the procedure or where they were even going when they were sent to see the off-site gynecologist who performs the procedure. The complaint states, quote, "When I met all these women who had surgeries, I thought this was an experimental concentration camp. It was like they were experimenting with our bodies." The Irwin Detention Facility is run by the private prison corporation LaSalle Corrections. Jesse, complaints have been filed about human rights violations at ICE detention facilities across the country. This is the latest. What's your reaction to how migrants are consistently mistreated?
It's horrifying, you know, when you think about it. This stuff that you're just telling me, Brigitte, these facts about them operating on them without this sounds like something out of Nazi Germany. This sounds like something I read about going on over there under the Nazis. This is insane. You don't have any right, because someone's an illegal immigrant or whatever you want to call them, to operate on their bodies, to change them, to do things to them. It's outrageous. And I'll tell you what, the problem may be because you're dealing with these private industries running the business again. Everybody says, oh, turn it over to the private sector. Well, when you turn it over to the private sector, you don't get very much when it comes to looking at it and finding out what's going wrong, because they're not going to admit to nothing like that. When corporations run things, bottom line profits, the bottom is all they think about. How much money can we make? This is outrageous, you know, and inhumane that they would do this. And look again what they're doing to a whistleblower. There's another example of whistleblowers getting the shaft.
Exactly. Now, while we're on the topic of immigration, experts warn that climate change will force a new American migration. Every year, climate events break records, and this year is no exception. So far this summer, California has experienced a record-breaking heat wave and record-breaking destruction from wildfires. As we previously reported, in August, the temperature in Death Valley hit 130 degrees, the highest ever recorded on Earth. Weeks later, in the Los Angeles suburb of Woodland Hills, a local weather station thermometer hit 121 degrees, the highest temperature in LA County history. The heat wave triggered power outages for hundreds of thousands of people in California, and over 900 fires have burned across the state in recent weeks, forcing over 100,000 people to flee. This summer, fires have not just raged through California, but also through Oregon and Washington, destroying over 5 million acres of land in the Pacific Northwest. And across the country, nearly 2,000 miles away in Louisiana and Texas, more than 500,000 people were told to flee as Hurricane Laura struck the Gulf Coast, causing $1.6 billion in damage to state crops and forests. That's more damage than Hurricanes Katrina and Rita combined. Jesse, we tend to think of climate refugees as people fleeing the poorest and hottest areas of the world. But according to the Urban Institute, more than 1.2 million Americans were already displaced in 2018 due to climate-related disasters. So a climate refugee crisis has already begun in the U.S. And if people start desperately escaping this hellish climate, millions of people potentially, do you think America is going to survive, or the world in general?
Well, I'll tell you what, we better start waking up, Brigitte, to that climate change and pollution. I like to include pollution in there because people understand that word, pollution. Climate change and pollution across this planet is real. We human beings are destroying it. Let's remember something. We don't give nothing to the planet as humans. We take. We're parasites. All we do is use the planet, use it over and over and over to whatever needs we have. And the planet's striking back now at us a little bit. If people don't realize that pollution, climate change is the next big war, this goes beyond all this stuff in the Middle East. It goes beyond all these little rinky-dink wars we have over who and how we govern our countries. This is the entire planet is being destroyed, and we're doing nothing about it because you got these doubters out there, like the ones who won't wear masks to stop germs. If masks don't work, why do they wear them in operating rooms then? You know, it's called common sense, people. Get rid of your egos and start looking out for each other instead of being so damn selfish.
We now cross over to Kentucky, where the city of Louisville has agreed to pay the family of Breonna Taylor $12 million to settle a wrongful death lawsuit for the police killing of the 26-year-old emergency medical technician. Taylor was shot dead in her home by police in early March after they kicked in her door to deliver a no-knock warrant in a narcotics case involving a suspect who may have previously used Taylor's address to receive packages. This is one case of many that has drawn protesters to the streets this year over police brutality and racism. Whether the officers who fired their guns that night will face criminal charges still remains to be seen. A grand jury is expected to determine their fate in the state's upcoming criminal case. Grand juries have historically sided with police officers in similar cases, but the nation's views on racism and police brutality have shifted drastically this year. So make your prediction. Are we going to see justice for Breonna Taylor or the exoneration of more police?
Well, it's hard to say. First of all, people need to understand how a grand jury works. When charges are brought up by the state and placed in front of the grand jury, there's no defense at this point. It's only an indictment that they're looking for. Is there enough evidence to indict? Generally, grand juries, if there is enough evidence, will indict. That doesn't mean the person's guilty. A trial awaits then, because at a grand jury, the defense can't do anything. They can't put up defense. It's only offense or prosecution used at a grand jury. So when you look at the situation of Breonna Taylor, you'd have to figure there's enough evidence there with no defense being worked in that the grand jury would bring some type of indictment down. Now, it's been nearly 6 months. They haven't brought it up yet in front of the grand jury, but I would assume an indictment will come down on the case. Now, again, that's merely an indictment. That is not necessarily a conviction. Everyone's entitled to a trial, and these police officers certainly deserve theirs, but there should be an indictment, and it should go to a jury trial to determine the wrongdoing. Do I think Breonna Taylor will go to trial? Yes, I think there'll be a trial, but I can't tell you if there'll be a conviction or not.
It's time for a quick break. When we return, Jesse sits down with RT's Chris Hedges to talk about Julian Assange's ongoing legal battle in the UK. We'll be right back.
I'm Jesse Ventura. Stay vigilant, question more. Welcome to my world. Come along for the ride. The world according to Jesse.
Joining me now is Chris Hedges, Pulitzer Prize-winning author, investigative journalist, and fellow RT host, to give us the latest on Julian Assange's fight against extradition. Chris, the extradition hearing has started for WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange in the UK. What do we know about the trial so far?
Well, there's been a kind of fascinating pivot, which shows that the prosecution has kind of changed several times the tact in terms of what they want to use to go after Julian. So, and I think what we saw in the beginning was a hesitation on the part. Remember, the Obama administration did not prosecute Julian because the lawyers said if we prosecute Julian Assange, we have to prosecute the New York Times, which published the WikiLeaks material along with the Guardian, Der Spiegel, and everything else. But all of that changed in the courtroom yesterday, and I think we found that quite chilling. And the prosecution stated in court, and I quote, "Any journalist can be prosecuted for publishing classified information," and that has now become the government line. And I think the reason for that is they realize that the mainstream media is not covering this. There's almost no attention When I tried to log on the other day, there were only 16 journalists following the court proceedings, which, by the way, go in and out. It's often there's no audio at all. So that's been where we are up until now in the hearing, which is expected to go for about 3 or 4 weeks.
Okay, now medical experts, lawyers, and legal academics have called on the British government to end the proceedings. What are their reasons, and has there been any response to this?
Yes. So Niels Melzer, the special UN rapporteur on torture, visited Julian along with 2 doctors, I believe psychologists, went in Belmarsh prison and issued a report saying that he had undergone psychological torture, both within the embassy. At the end, Lenin Moreno, the new president of Ecuador, who has close ties to Washington, instituted a very punishing and brutal kind of living regime on Julian. They cut off his internet. They stopped him from having visitors, constant kind of harassment, trying to force him out. It didn't work. The police came and got him. He's now in solitary confinement. He's not allowed outside. He's been kept in a glass cage in court, although it's interesting that when his defense attorneys asked that he be allowed to sit with them at the defense table, the prosecution on behalf of the U.S. didn't actually object, but Baritza, the judge, who's been very kind of caustic and even rude towards Julian and his lawyers, refused. He strip searched. He doesn't have virtually any contact with his lawyers. He's not allowed to see his defense papers. I mean, on and on and on. And they argue that these kinds of conditions will be exacerbated, and they're not wrong, because he'll be put under what we call SAMs, special administration measures. We've seen it with Muslims who've been targeted after 9/11. So they're not only are they held in isolation, but they're actually, the state can bring in secret witnesses. You don't know who they are. They can present secret evidence that the defense never sees. And then you have the whole issue of COVID. So health experts on both, because of the psychological and physical conditions that would be clearly imposed upon Julian should he be extradited, have argued that it's inhumane. Those conditions are inhumane.
Now, American officials claim that U.S. espionage laws apply to the world. Meanwhile, they also say that American Constitution protects things such as the First Amendment and the right to a free press. How do they get by with saying both of these? It seems like it's, hypocritical, one side and the other.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that the whole over a period of many months, the whole U.S. prosecution of Julian, it's filled with those kinds of contradictions. I found the court proceedings today extremely chilling because essentially they were arguing that the U.S. government has the right to supersede under the Espionage Act the First Amendment. I mean, what's really happening here is that they're setting a legal precedent. So journalists have, and when I wrote for the New York Times, indeed published classified material on the front page of the New York Times. So journalists have traditionally, when they get material, been able to publish it without prosecution. All of that would change under Julian. So you're right that what's happening here is essentially avoiding out of the First Amendment and setting a kind of precedent whereby it will become impossible for journalists to shine a light on the inner workings of power.
Now, if Assange is prosecuted under the Espionage Act, what would it mean for the future of journalism and publishing?
Well, I think we have to look at Assange as a publisher rather than as a journalist. So Chelsea Manning leaked Julian this material, and Julian published it. He shared it with the Afghan and Iraq war logs were shared with numerous publications around the world, Der Spiegel, etc., and the New York Times, etc. So, but what it will mean is that all of these publications, these traditional mainstream publications, become vulnerable. And I did a panel with Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked the Pentagon Papers, and then James Goodall, which people can watch on YouTube. And Goodall was the lead counsel for the New York Times when the government tried to stop publication. And I think Goodall and Ellsberg were quite emphatic that that the danger of this for traditional media outlets is, catastrophic.
Now, piggybacking on that, what about U.S. publications? Is there any concern about charges being brought against the New York Times or other news organizations that publish and report on classified information via WikiLeaks?
So I think that at the beginning of this hearing, that's why we saw the superseding indictment, that they walked away from the Espionage Act charges in the superseding indictment. And I think that was a way to essentially mollify or attempt to mollify the press by saying, don't worry, we're not going after him for the publication of this material. We're going after him for a series of criminal acts, many of which I would argue he didn't even commit. So, but now that they have seen that there's so little outcry, I mean, this is just not being covered. I find it staggering, but it's just not being covered, that they have now gone back to their original charge under the Espionage Act. Now, this is not about determining his guilt in this hearing. It's about determining whether the charges are substantial enough or credible enough that he can be extradited. And then, of course, he would be charged under the Espionage Act. But I'm stunned at the inability on the part of the New York Times and most other media to cover a hearing and a case that will have immense implications for their ability to practice journalism.
You know, you kind of hit my next question there. That's how good you are. Has mainstream media done an accurate and good, fair job covering the Julian Assange case? And if not, what's been missing?
Well, all of it's been missing. They're just not covering it at all. I mean, just journalistically, this isn't a political issue. I know Julian and visited him many times in the embassy, and am a huge admirer of him and what WikiLeaks has done. But that's irrelevant. I mean, journalistically, where are they? And they've checked out. And I think that stunned even the U.S. government, which has now allowed the U.S. government to be far more aggressive, as we saw today in the courtroom.
Now, why should everyone be concerned about how this case plays out?
Because if Julian is extradited, and I think there's very little doubt that if he was hauled up in court in Alexandria, Virginia, he would be found guilty, then essentially power becomes totally unaccountable. And that's why. And once power is unaccountable, all of the inevitable abuses of power, criminal activity, lies, manipulation, all of that is essentially relegated to a kind of dark hole that the public can't see. And history, I think, has repeatedly shown the very pernicious consequences of ruling elites that are able to maintain control without accountability.
Now, Chris, make your prediction. Do you think the UK will allow Assange to be extradited?
I would find it highly unlikely that they would block the extradition, especially given the judge who's been assigned to the case, Baritza, whose husband was in the UK defense establishment and now works for the private war industry for defense contractors, and then given her open hostility towards Assange in the courtroom and repeated denial of even the most innocuous requests, such as, is it really necessary that he be strip searched in and out of the courtroom? Can't he meet with his lawyers? Does he have to be in a cage? She has made many very caustic comments to Julian himself. So I think that most of us who are following the case believe that extradition is almost certain.
And finally, how might the Assange case affect Edward Snowden? A U.S. Court of Appeals recently ruled that the NSA's bulk data collection program was illegal. How do you think it'll affect Snowden?
I don't think it will affect Edward Snowden in a sense that I don't see the United States changing its position. Snowden, of course, is also charged under the Espionage Act. When Edward Snowden revealed wholesale government surveillance of the public, we saw a complete collapse of the judiciary. I mean, this is a wholesale violation of our constitutional right to privacy, and the courts did nothing. The legislative branch of government did nothing. The evidence was incontrovertible, and yet they did nothing. And I think that's what so many of us find so chilling, that even in the face of this evidence, which Edward Snowden so courageously provided to the American public, the system has not responded to protect our most basic constitutional rights.
Well, Chris, that's why you always say it. We're mice, but we got to keep squeaking. I want to thank you very much, very, very much for your time and expertise today. You cleared up a lot of things for us. Thank you, Chris Hedges. Look forward to seeing you on RT.
Great. Thanks, Jesse.
The world according to Jesse.
Thanks for watching. Send us your comments online for a chance to be featured in next week's episode. We'll be covering more stories ignored by the corporate media.
And as always, people, remember, when the government lies, the truth becomes a traitor. Stay vigilant and wear your mask.
The world according to Jesse.